So, but yeah, this is fun for me though because getting to talk about art and Spanish art especially is really wonderful for me because Spain's absolutely one of my most favorite places in the world. And I know you're going to be going up into France and everything as well. But this kind of area that we're talking about, like right on the border here, is a really fertile area for a lot of really brilliant art. Some of the most famous artist in the world after Da Vinci basically comes from this region. So of course Picasso, which is kind of like he's kind of the chapstick or the Kleenex of artists. You know, he kind of becomes the brand, right? You know, oh, aren't you a Picasso and you paint really well or something, right? As Harriet mentioned, I've been to Spain several times, and so I did my study abroad when I was in college near a little suburb of Madrid, actually, so right smack down in the middle there. And so, in my kind of artistic background, one of the things that I'm most interested in personally in art is Moorish art, which is the art of the time when Spain was under Muslim rule, which was actually for close to 800 years, actually more than 800 years, which a lot of people don't even realize. It was actually for a very long time. Today, most of the remains of that culture are more strongly condensed down in the southern part of Spain. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot today, but it's just, you know, this is kind of my wheelhouse in general, so that's kind of just a little bit of background. So anyway, we'll start out here. I'm going to stick over here so we can kind of just poke the keys on this. I'm not sure if that exactly works, so we'll just go low tech here. This is a logo you'll probably see a lot around Spain when you're there. And this is actually designed by a very famous Spanish artist, kind of sort of a surrealist, symbolist, abstractionist, Juan Miró. And one of the things that you'll notice we'll talk about in a minute is, you know, when you pronounce his name, it's Juan, but you notice it's spelled differently. And that's because, as we'll talk about, you guys will realize that he comes from the Catalonia area of Spain, which is right up here. And they have a distinct language. It's related to Spanish, but it is a distinct language. Some of the words, most of the words, if you know Spanish, will look fairly similar, but they might be slightly different than what you'll see in Spanish. So like I said, regions of Spain. And you might have talked about this a little bit, I won't belabor the point, but it sounds like you guys are going to be mostly in, I think the heating system makes this jump a little bit, so I apologize about that.
That's
but anyway,
fine.
like up around this area. And some of the more interesting, you know, Spain isn't one cohesive culture. It was a lot of different kingdoms that came together over time and that have, even today, a distinct identity. Probably the ones that have the most distinct identity are Catalonia, where Barcelona is the capital of, and then the País Vasco, which is the Basque country, which is an area that's been fighting for independence for a long time, off and on in various ways, shapes, and forms. And that has, speaking of language, has a language that is not connected to any other language on earth. It's its own distinct language. So pretty interesting places. The País Vasco is where the Bilbao is. And honestly, I've not been to Bilbao. I've been to the Basque country, but I've not been to Bilbao, so I'm not going to talk about that too much tonight. Harriet mostly asked me to talk about some of the big boys like Dali, Picasso, Gaudi, those kind of fellows.
Jessica Case is going to talk
Great,
about that because she was just there this summer.
Yeah, great. Just to kind of clarify too, you know, you guys are going to be going to Toledo as well. So that's about an hour outside of Madrid. That's a really beautiful town. I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And it's kind of interesting to know, just historical-wise, that if you look at Madrid today, it's smack dab in the middle of the country, and that was made the capital in 1561. It's kind of a compromise, I guess, amongst the kingdoms that were fighting for the capital. And so they just plopped it right smack in the middle, so nobody was happy and everybody was happy. You'll also, you know, this is in a different region of Spain. I believe this is up more like in the Galicia region, which is in the northwest corner of Spain. But just for, you know, a very, very brief, I'm sure you'll get more of this from Steve Tulin and whatnot, but very brief history of Spain is that, you know, it was occupied by the Romans for a long time. You'll see some evidence of that Roman architecture and remains when you're there. Even in a lot of places around Toledo has a lot of Roman ruins around there. Kind of to ask around because it's not really evident what's, you know, that age and what's not. But you know, things like this in Segovia, Spain, are really obvious references to that Roman architecture. and remains. And as I mentioned, this Moorish Spain, you'll probably see some little vestiges of this. I just kind of want to familiarize you a little bit with it in case you see some of this stuff over there. And so as I said, from 711 to 1492, Spain was ruled by Muslim rulers and that come up from North Africa. And they're part of the Umayyad dynasty, if you ever, if you follow any of this stuff at all. And their capital was in Cordoba, which is down in the south part of Spain. And so that's, as I said, a really strong area for this, for that culture, so kind of remaining of it. But I thought I'd show you this too, because a lot of the things that you'll see, especially in places like Toledo as well, are kind of vestiges of some of the same history. So what you see in this image here is down here, you see Muslim architecture, flat building, extensive, goes far. Okay, right in the middle, plopped smack dab, squatting in the middle of this mosque is a Catholic cathedral. Okay, what do you think that tells us? What happened there? What would you guess? Yeah, they claimed the sacred spaces back when the Catholic, especially Ferdinand and Isabella, kind of wrapped up what they call the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain through the Christians, especially the Catholics. And what they would do is they would take the sacred spaces of the previous rulers and reappropriate it for themselves. And so you'll see a lot of that around Spain, especially inside the Great Mosque of Cordoba. You'll also see vestiges of these in a lot of the architecture around Spain, these arches, and especially these candy-striped arches. You'll see little bits and pieces of that in some of your travels as well. And just to kind of show you a little bit more about this too, just kind of make a comparison. This is inside the mosque. There's a mihrab, the direction that you pray to Mecca for a Muslim. And then they also have a very Baroque gold-gilded altarpiece that's kind of like two sides of the same coin for a different religion. In Sevilla, also in southern Spain, but just kind of to reiterate a little bit about this, that the same kind of idea, that a lot of the things that kind of are very Spain with the capital S, flamenco, things like that, come from that Muslim culture. And like one of the most famous Gothic cathedrals in Europe, kind of high Gothic cathedrals, neo-Gothic, actually use a minaret, a Muslim prayer tower, for their church tower. So again, that appropriation. And then, on the Guadalquivir River in Spain, there's Muslim architecture from an old tower that they used to control ships along the river and shipping. And so a lot of the things that we even know is really indicative of Spain, exemplary of it, come from this idea. So just, to wrap up the history part, the Alhambra was the Moorish palace that was the last stand before the Reconquista really, ended in 1492. So, I apologize a little bit. I usually do my presentations on a Mac, and this isn't a big example of this, but some of the typography might be a little bit different when it translates to PC. It might look a little wonky, so sorry about that. Anyway, so in Toledo, it's a fairly small town, but it's got a lot of really beautiful ancient history and architecture to really explore. It's a really fun town to explore. And You'll definitely note some landmarks like the Alcazar, which was it was a Roman bastion, and then it was later in much more modern times it was the site of a famous standoff in the Spanish Civil War and things like that. So it carries a lot of Spanish history with it, but it's a big landmark in town. You'll see that. But another of the interesting aspects of Toledo is that it's got this religion is a real thread throughout the interesting history of Spain. And Toledo is really well known for being one of the places in Europe, but especially in Spain, where for a time at least, there was a brokered peace amongst the three main religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that were all kind of a mix in that from the heritage of this place back from, when those religions spread. And so you'll find evidence of this, and look for this around Toledo, that there are evidence of Muslim Spain and these Muslim architecture designs. They sometimes call Muslim-influenced architecture or Moorishly influenced architecture. They call it mudehar. And so you might just see that on signs or something like that. And so any place that's got arches and patternings and really intricate geometric type work, it's probably mudehar architecture. And then of course there are remnants of the ancient That, if you notice, has been appropriated as a Christian chapel now. And they even call it the Mosque of Christ of the Light. Mosquito de Cristo de la Luz. So interesting. And Jewish Toledo as well. They have an ancient synagogue as well, which is an interesting building too. It was erected on land owned by the Christians, but it was built and designed by Moorish architectures for the Jews. And so this is a really good example of the much more symbiotic relationship that people had for, again, during this period before things got kind of crazy. And from then on we have Catholic Toledo, which is the other dominant piece of architecture in Toledo will be the giant high Gothic cathedral there. Really beautiful, go check it out. It's a stunning example of that sort of thing. Sure, you might go to some of the places in France and you'll have seen that kind of architecture, but it's a good refresher to know that same kind of idea was passed along into these other European places as well. Sure.
Yeah. What was the date that you said they left?
1492. You can remember by
Yeah.
Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
That was a big year.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it, right? Well, and it's, Spain was really, it was kind of a golden age for Spain. They were really establishing themselves as those shipping powers and that exploratory power. You have all the great Spanish explorers and, the financing by Ferdinand and Isabella for Cristobal Colon, and there's a statue to him in Barcelona that if you want to go drive around the traffic circle a bunch of times and wave at Columbus as you go by, so.
So could I ask a
Yeah,
question
absolutely.
in the same line? So there's a big Jewish influence in Morocco. Did the Jews who tried to convert or leave, is that where they left to kind of thing?
I actually don't know that for sure, but my speculation is no.
I don't think
Maybe
so.
by then they went to Israel.
I think they probably spread out around different parts of Europe. Some went to Italy. Many converted.
Yeah.
Many converted. That would probably be the most of what happened.
Some went to Portugal.
Yeah,
There were
yeah,
quite
that's
a
right,
few
yeah.
went to Portugal.
There was a group
Yeah.
here last year that sings the music of the Jews who were displaced from
Right.
Toledo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
they were already
the language is Ladrino, and they settled in Macedonia, north of Greece.
Yeah, but they were already in Morocco. And as Ann said, I think the majority ended up converting and then hiding their Judaism. They converted publicly, but.
Which eases us into the Spanish Inquisition, right?
And they're the ones who became the Sephardic, they're known as Sephardic Jews as opposed to Ashkenazi, which are East European.
So getting into some of the artwork, El Greco is a local boy, sort of, from Toledo. El Greco is a famous artist, and he was actually Greek to begin with. He was Menikos Diakonopoulos. Diakonopoulos. Yeah. Poulos. Okay. All right, there you go. You told me how to pronounce that. Yeah. It's fun to say regardless, though. But this is a landscape he did of Toledo, and it's kind of neat to see that you can check out the sky, the photograph, and the image, how closely he was getting the feel of that place.
Would that be in the Prado?
No, I don't think this one is actually. I can't remember where this one is at, but it might be. There is a small El Greco museum in Toledo if you're interested. It's a nice, cute little. It doesn't take very long. Maybe like an hour type museum. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But El Greco is one of the most preeminent Spanish painters, and so what I'm kind of going for today is not to make you. I'm not going to quiz you guys on this or anything like that, but just to give you some sense of having seen this stuff before, so you can see like, oh yeah, I recognize that, and have just some context for this. I remember when I went to Spain for the first time when I was in early college, and we went to the Prado, me and my friend, but I hadn't taken art history yet. And even though I was interested in art, I really didn't know a lot about a lot of the art that was in that type of building, and so it kind of fell flat a little bit to me. And because it's real, a lot of the art in the Prado, that classical kind of Baroque-ish Spanish art, is kind of dark and it's a little moody, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it can be kind of a downer if you're not kind of interested in it and prepared for that in some ways. But anyway, El Greco, you will definitely note him because he has these long stretched figures and these sad-eyed
The hands.
Yeah, those long hands. He was influenced by something called mannerism, which is kind of an offshoot of Renaissance art that stretched the figures out instead of having them perfectly proportioned. This is one of his famous pieces that he did, kind of like an annunciation, but it was for a burial of a donor. The Prado, then, as I was mentioning, built in the 1800s as an art museum, so it wasn't reappropriated for anything else. It was just for art. And so you'll see some El Grecos in there. You will also see, just going to run through some of the people that you might have heard of that you'll, if you haven't heard of them, you will have now, kind of thing. You can just kind of see, kind of name check some of the people that you'll have seen there. So Raphael, Titian, who really established our idea of what the Venus figure kind of was after the Greeks, and those, I get kind of a kick out of that top one up there. Talk about a first-class leer. Anyway, this is also the place in the Prado. It's not all Spanish art. In fact, there's a pretty strong presence of Northern European Flemish art as well. Most of the art in the Prado is kind of more classically styled. There's not a lot of ancient classical. There's a smattering of that, but most of it is kind of late Renaissance. Its heyday is kind of late Renaissance, Baroque, into the 17 and 1800s kind of artwork. That's mostly their wheelhouse there. That's their strength. And so they have a lot of different artists, not just the Spanish ones. And one of the best paintings, most interesting pieces of artwork in the Prado is the Garden of Earthly Life by Northwest College. And this is like nothing else that was done at this time. This was a total anomaly, a weird thing. Because most of the artwork up until the mid-1800s was usually done in a particular style that was dictated really strongly by the culture and the haves and that were paying the people that were painting and sculpting these type of images. So this is a real offshoot. It's probably painted for a private person, not for public display, likely. And this is just, it's like Dr. Seuss meets Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't know. It's one of the most fascinating things you'll ever see. Some of these are and it's big. It's big. It's something like 7 by 12 feet or something like that. You just spend all day looking at this. It looked like terrible fun to paint this thing. I mean, it's
wow.
Yeah, and it's beautifully. The Flemish painters you'll notice and the Northern European painters have really precise style. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It said 1505 to 1550. Did it take them 10 years to paint this?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I think I put that because that was when he started and that was when he finished. He probably was off and on it.
Right,
He wasn't,
right, but
working
that's
on it
still a
constantly.
10-year painting.
Yeah.
That's
And I suspect, he did each. I don't have the exact every little bit of history on each one of these pieces, but since it's a triptych, he painted them separately, likely, and then kept adding to them and things like that. So.
Spanish have fun faces.
Oh yeah, I mean
Everybody looks like the same.
Well, yeah, and you can argue that about the Italians sometimes too, but with the Renaissance work. But it kind of depends on the work. But the Flemish painters weren't as closely into observation as the Italian painters, Renaissance painters were. They were more about precision of detail, and they had oil paint before the Italians did, and so they had this really lush, crisp line, linear quality and things. And so that technique of crispness was more important in detail than it was than the passion and the proportion and things like that of the Italian Renaissance. Anyway, these are some of the details of it. You can spend all day looking at this. I don't know. I mean, some of them are kind of a little but funny at the same time. This one is supposedly a little bitty jab at the Christian church, taking the nun's habit, but it's down at the bottom left or bottom right hand corner. And we're also going to be talking about Salvador Dali, and one has to wonder if this painting is in the Prado, and when Salvador Dali is growing up, I think that there was probably a pretty strong influence on him. You'll also see this. We usually only know that one image by Ernest Bosch, but he did paint other ones, and they were kind of weird too. He did this one that's like a God's eye, but then it has the 7 deadly sins and painted in scenes around it, and they're kind of bizarrely painted. I mean, the guy with the chair in his head, and they're smashing at him with a machete. I mean, it's just
I had to do a psychology study on
Oh,
that
yeah,
before.
yeah, kind of forensic psychology, yeah. Some other ones you'll see there that kind of in a similar theme, but a little less surreal. Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death. I'm just gonna roll through these. I'm not gonna, you can go through these, but these are some big names. Albert Dürer, very, very famous. He's kind of like the Da Vinci of Northern Europe. Peter Paul Rubens, those round, voluptuous ladies, swirly ladies, you'll find them. You can see those with Peter Rubens. There are a smattering of classical Greek sculptures, Roman copies of Greek sculptures, like the Venus of the Dolphin, that is one of the obvious influences for Botticelli's Birth of Venus. There's a Venus of Madrid there, interestingly enough. It's kind of like the Venus de Milo, but where she has her chest covered instead of unveiled.
Burkina.
What's that?
A Burkina.
Yeah. And there are a smattering of, your big fellows like Caravaggio of the Baroque period. And it's kind of interesting to see, I was reading through some of my journals when I was preparing for this, and I noted in there, I was like, okay, I go through this whole museum of great masters, and yet some just stand out. And I'm not even like a fangirl of Caravaggio hugely. I love him, but I think it's not. But man, you walk through and you can, Caravaggio pulls you in. And just a little background on him: Italian Baroque painter, kind of a rogue, and he would often paint his Goliaths. They're usually a self-portrait of himself. He painted David and Goliath a lot, and so he painted himself as the monster. Real master of light. Another one of my favorite paintings in the Prado is this Northern European artist Roger van der Weyden's deposition image. And this one, all I will say is that none of these paintings, none of these artworks are done any justice by this. This is, again, just a little context, just so you kind of recognize the stuff. You'll be blown away by this stuff when you see it in person. It's kind of ho-hum, some of it, when you're just kind of glancing at it. But go up to this painting and examine this guy's robe when you get there. Every mark, like if you were sewing that embroidery on there, is done in a separate mark of paint. It's just like he sewed that with paint. It's just stunning. And that focus on material had a lot to do with the merchant culture in Northern Europe at the time, and the richness of material. But cool things like Jesus echoing the shape of Mary, the Vanitas skull down here, the reminder of death. Even it's right there anyway, right in this one. But those are really significant European Northern Europe. See lots of Annunciation images where Mary is told by the angel Gabriel that she's pregnant with Jesus. Famous Italian early Renaissance painter Fra Angelico. Similarly themed. And this one is funny because if you look into this one, you'll find lots that's wrong with it. We kind of forget that when we see artwork that's painted photorealistically, like it looks like real life now, we forget how hard that is to do. And that for most of human history, artists did not actually paint what they saw. That was something that came about. The Greeks kind of started them on that, and then the Renaissance picked that up later on with the Italians. But the Northern Europeans struggled with that a little bit more. So you'll notice in here that, again, the lushness of the fact, the stuff that's hanging around, the kettle right here, that, if you go up and examine that at the Prado, it's stunningly painted. It looks like the actual material there. But then you look at this, and these guys are kneeling down to go into this doorway here that if they stood up, they would pop through the ceiling, right? This bench looks like it's about 20 feet long in a room that looks like it's about 10 feet long. So but then they're showing little vestiges of trying to mess with proportion and perspective and things like that. But they're just kind of clunky with it. But boy, do they have the material detail down, So Andrea Mantegna is an Italian who was really into perspective, and so you'll see his perspective compared to Campin's perspective is really stunningly well done, right? And he did some really bizarrely painted images. Getting into some of the Spanish painters, Bartolomeo Murillo, Francisco Zurbarán. This is a painting of St. Peter. You can tell, you'll see lots of upside down images. St. Peter was famously crucified upside down, and here he is discussing his predicament with a different St. Peter, like St. Peter of the or something like that. I can't remember what his name is, but anyway, they're conversing about the predicament here. Zurbarán was another famous Spanish painter along with Murillo. And then Diego Velázquez is, you're noticing too probably that these are a little hard to see sometimes, right? These are dark paintings, okay? And yet, so I'll explain that in a minute, but let me tell you a little bit about Velázquez, because he's a really influential guy. Picasso emulated him. Dali emulated him. I mean, many, many other artists around the world actually looked at this guy with much homage. And one of the things that he did was he was kind of known for breaking down some of the fourth wall almost of painting. Like, and when I say fourth wall, I mean like it's when, what that term means is essentially it's kind of like when, okay, somebody's filming a TV show. The actors aren't supposed to look in the camera, because if they look in the camera, they connect with the viewer, and it connects in a way that tells you that this isn't real. And it takes away the illusion, right? And so that's called breaking the fourth wall. And that's what Velázquez kind of does in this painting, and it was never done before. It was always like, artwork was supposed to be this illusionistic thing, and you were supposed to just pretend it wasn't created. Family who won the lottery. So, he also painted his famous series of the Venus paintings called the Mahas, and he first painted the Maha Desnuda. The Maha is kind of like a socialite, kind of a hanger-arounder of the court, sort of a Kim Kardashian of the 1800s. And this caused a scandal, of course, because she was so unabashedly embarrassed about her nudity. And so then he had to paint the Maha Vestida, which is the dress. Probably his most famous painting, well, he has two, but this is one of his most famous, is the 3rd of May, where he was portraying Napoleon's forces invading Madrid and killing some of the dissidents and rebels that were trying to fight off the forces. And he painted this, his central figure is kind of a Christ-like figure, a martyr, right? And he does the light in a very non-realistic way, but that focuses your attention right on that person. It's not about the precision and the delicacy of the Italian Renaissance. It's thick, it's puppety, it's almost bready kind of in how it's painted. And so it's kind of this common person way of dealing with that paint in a sense that doesn't idealize it, doesn't, it brings it back down to earth in a lot of ways. So this is probably his other most famous painting. It's part of a series called the Black Paintings, the Pinturas Negras. And these are not literally black, though they're very dark, but they're very dark in mood. It's just more of the reason that they're called this. And this is a really weird little tidbit about these paintings, and these are a lot of these are in the Prado as well, is that they were murals in Goya's house. Okay? So you're like, well, why did we go from puppetry and children playing and to, a monster devouring someone? Well, there are a lot of reasons. He had some just disillusionment with the political structure as well, and this is probably more of a political allegory than it is a mythological allegory. But one of the significant things that happened to him was that due to a mysterious illness, he went deaf. Somewhere around that point after he was really significant as a court painter there, and he started getting darker and darker in his images. He started to be more isolated in his life after that time, and he probably fell into depression. And so what he started to do was he started to paint from an emotional place rather than just a practical and pragmatic, like from a donor kind of paying me to do this style sort of place. And that sort of sets him, it was sort of painting for painting's sake in a sense. And that sort of sets him up as kind of the first modern artist, where it wasn't for practical reasons, some of this stuff. This is called Saturn devouring his one of his own children, or his son, depending on how you want to interpret the title. But Goya didn't give this painting that title. Other people did, as a way of explaining. They're like, this is so disturbing. I can't think what he must have been trying to portray here, except, of course, it must have been a myth, Greco-Roman myth, right? We'll just go with that because it explains why he would paint such a disturbing image. This might have had a little bit more to do with his state of mind and also some of his quibbles about the government at the time, too, kind of eating its own, things like that. So, little gruesome painting. This is another one. It's called the dog. It is, and so yeah, look at the compositions of these, and it's just bleak, you know. It's bleak. Here's some other ones. He gives the cats the treatment, the Gappelrigliendo, which is the cats fighting. They're fighting off the edge of the cliff. He parallels that with a human version of this. I didn't title this one, but this is two old men eating soup.
Oh,
Practically
God.
skeletons. This is the witches' Sabbath. You know, so you pulled out some. Yeah. And then this kind of leads us, speaking of modernity, into probably one of our biggest artists ever, which is Pablo Picasso. And he lived a long time. He lived until he was 92, and he was extraordinarily prolific. He did between 10 and 20,000 artworks in his lifetime. And judging from the measurement that he really kind of started to do art professionally when he was about 11, that means that he averaged about a painting every 2 days for 80 some years. Okay, that's quite prolific. Okay, so anyway, a little bit of his history is that we all know Picasso for his one indicative style, his cubistic style. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but we'll see where he came from. He was born in Barcelona, and his father was an artist as well, but he was more of a traditional artist. In fact, his father liked to paint pigeons. But he was more of what we call an academic style artist, not somebody who was really looking to push the boundaries of art, but one that was just looking to make a living with it, refine your technical skill, that sort of thing. And not really someone that was looking to push boundaries. He actually took his mother's last name, and in Spain, the way I didn't usually include both names. I just used the one that the artist most commonly went by on these. And almost all of these artists that we're looking at have a much longer name, like Velázquez's Diego Isilda, I want to say Fernando de Velázquez or something like that. And Picasso's is Pablo Picasso Ruiz. No, Ruiz Picasso. And but he took their father's name goes first and the mother's name goes second in the hyphenation. And so it was a little bit unusual that Picasso took his mother's last name. Her last name was Picasso. It was actually Italian origin. So, I think he might have given him a little more pop. Ruiz was a much more common name. So. Anyway, so this is a drawing that he did when he was age 8. So he was considered kind of a prodigy. I mean, I don't know. That looks like an 8-year-old drawing to me, but he advanced very quickly, right? So pretty much by the time he was in his mid-teens, he kind of felt like he'd pretty much done all that needed to be done in traditional academic forms of art, right? He went into the art academy at age 14. I guess he wasn't born in Barcelona, excuse me, but he did move to Barcelona at a young age and went to the art academy fairly soon afterwards. He got some art awards for his traditional forms of work. This was a portrait of his mother, in fact. But when he ended up going on to the art academy, the Royal Academy in Madrid, and he probably would have had a successful if unremarkable career as an academic artist, if he just kind of stayed in that environment. But he ended up getting sick when he was at the Madrid Royal Academy of Art, and he moved back home, and he started falling in with some modernists around Barcelona again. And so that sent him off in this different direction where he started to experiment. And so what he did is he ended up in 1900, in fact, actually, let me tell you this too. There's a cafe in Barcelona called the Four Cats, and it's in Catalonia. It's like the Gas or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce Catalonian, but it's the cafe that Picasso used to hang out in a lot. So was the two maggots was another one that he hung around in. So a lot of animal references there. But in 1900, he went to Paris, and he was kind of freed up. He wasn't going to the academy anymore, so he went to Paris. And what he saw in Paris were guys like Monet and Manet and Toulouse-Lautrec and Van Gogh. And all these artists, Monet's the original impressionist. He's the one that kind of drove through the idea of the first real modern art movement that once photography came along, it kind of freed up in the early 1800s, early 1820s, 1830s. It kind of freed up artwork, especially painting, two-dimensional work, to go different places. It didn't have to have that documentary traditional style anymore. It didn't have to have that fidelity to what it was before. So it sparked this whole revolution of all these different ways of looking at the world. And that's what we kind of talked about as far as modern art. And so Picasso saw all these guys that were experimenting with all these different styles. And you see everything from these thick brush strokes to the Manet and Monet and Van Gogh even, and some of these kind of illustrative blocky styles like Toulouse-Lautrec. I mean, this almost looked like a Cafe Kolovitz to me. I mean, they experimented with printmaking. I mean, just all this different things. He wasn't finding himself, but he was copying a lot of people. Okay? He was trying to figure something out. I'd say almost that Toulouse-Lautrec early on was one of his stronger influences. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was one of the very early graphic designer, if you will. He designed a lot of posters for things like the Moulin Rouge in Paris, and did a lot of the illustrations and dancers there and whatnot. So this is a Picasso, and you can see how closely that mimics drawings by Toulouse-Lautrec and Degas at the time. Here's another comparison to him with Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, and how his style kind of echoed that. So he was trying things out. And then he starts to kind of find something, okay? So around the 1901, he was very poor. He wasn't making it very well as an artist, and one of his good friends committed suicide. It kind of sent him in this place called his blue period, where he obviously was reflecting through color his mood, right? And kind of this sort of desolate view of the world at that time. And then he kind of came out of that. He started hanging around with a different group of friends, kind of came out of that. And he went into something called the rose period. It wasn't strictly just pinks and reds, but it was a much brighter color palette, and he kind of painted a little more frivolous things like scary dudes with little kids sitting on their laps, and clowns and circus performers and things like that, and Gertrude Stein at the bottom there. And anyway, so those are some of his precursors to full-on Cubism. But also more or less around the same time period, a little bit after this, he started experimenting with this idea of breaking down a figure. Okay? He got this idea from, actually no, not really. Duchamp painted the roofs and staircase around the same time, so it was an influence, I'm sure. But more the idea came initially from this viewing of African masks and ancient Iberia is the peninsula in Spain and Portugal are on, masks that had this kind of planar, I think I've got some examples in here, this kind of planar, very geometrically oriented way of depicting human faces, for example. And so these were something that people were kind of bringing back from their travels, and was infusing into this kind of global culture around Paris at the time. And he started to kind of pick up on this, and he was working with a guy named Georges Braque, who history kind of forgets as the co-inventor of this famous style, because Braque got drafted in World War I, and he kind of had to, Picasso didn't, so Picasso ran with this idea, and Braque kind of got left by the wayside with it. But you can start to see him kind of play with the planes of a figure. And then he started to take with this idea, the kind of the essence of what Cubism became, which is reducing something down to its most essential parts, right? That it's still that thing, and we still recognize it, even with minimal information. So this is kind of this idea. I mean, even this is fairly abstract, but if you translate this or watch this, how he works this into a plane that gets simpler and simpler and simpler, and just shape-oriented. Down here, you go from something that's got shading and muscle tone and depth and things like that, and dimension. But this is still abstract. This isn't real. It's illusionistic too. He just drew it. It's not. You can't pick that off, and it's not going to run around the floor, right? I mean, it's not real. It's all an illusion. This is as abstract as this, actually. Okay, that's kind of his point that he's making in some ways. And so he played around with this idea of reducing things down to its essential parts. This is another very famous one. I love this. 4 lines. Da Vinci spends, years trying to finish something in sfumato, and this rounded model and gradations and everything. And Picasso just goes, know, there it is, you know, describe the same thing.
The bowl looks like a cave painting.
Yes, oh, which, exactly, and Altamira in Spain was the first really truly, like strongly discovered cave art in Europe. And that's, I'm not sure exactly where Altamira is, but it's in Spain somewhere, so he would have certainly heard about that. He said that those things that we have learned nothing. That's what he said about the cave paintings. And all the time from 30,000 BCE when those were painted, we have learned nothing. That's what he said.
And that was the year that Paul started, so that's.
Was it really?
Perspective.
Wow,
That's the year
okay.
Paul started. 1809 is the year that Paul started.
Awesome.
I can see them.
Is that the main street?
Some of Picasso's other, you know, kind of iconic artworks had to do with these doves, and he, like a lot of artists post-World War II, declared himself a communist. You know, there were artists like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were famous versions of this too. And if, you know, this was the type of ascribing to communism that was, you know, before it was associated with that Vietnam and Cold War era boogeyman, you know, kind of thing. It was more like the idea of just strongly linked to equality was an important idea. So he even named one of his daughters Paloma, which means dove, and he was associating that idea of the dove with the communistic idea of peace. So you see that as a
Now,
common
this will
icon.
be in Barcelona, the Picasso Museum, where we would see these.
And so just to kind of give you an overview of just a summary of how he evolved in his lifetime, a lot of people look at artists that focus on abstract style as, they say, why did 4-year-olds do that? Why did they do that? It's bad. It's bad. It's badly drawn. No, it's a choice. He's trying to make, it's not about the technique. He doesn't want to just show off his technique, his photorealism. He wants to make you think. He wants to break down barriers. He wants to open up new doors, not just give you something that you've seen before, that you can see in front of you in your life. He wants to make you feel something, right? Think about something. And so sometimes by abstracting things, we understand the emotion behind them better. So he was kind of, you know, this was an early version of it. Oh yeah, here we go. He was looking at artists like Paul Cézanne and those African masks. Paul Cézanne was a contemporary of Van Gogh, and he started to look at how an image was constructed, kind of like Velázquez did. But he took it further and started to look at like the blocks of color that made up an image. And so he was kind of a very, very early version of Cubism. And so whereas you would normally see a French landscape, and Cézanne was French, being painted like Laurent up there, that was very traditionally formed. You can tell what everything is, and it's very, you know, kind of like they're striving for photorealism. An avant-garde artist wasn't striving for photorealism. They're trying to strive for intellectual fidelity in a sense, you know, more of a way, a different way of looking at things. And Picasso carried on this with his famous Demoiselles d'Avignon, that he promoted this idea called the simultaneity of vision. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but what he was trying to do is say, I'm looking at things from more than one perspective at once. I'm looking at things from more than one point of view at once. Now, you might take that in a real literal sense and say, okay, well, he's got the side of her nose showing, and you know, he's got her face in profile where her eye is frontal. You can take that in a literal sense, but he was also talking about it in a symbolic sense. That in the modern world, things aren't just black and white all the time. They aren't just either or. As sometimes we have to understand the gray area between things and see things from more than one point of view at a time. And so that's kind of some of his idea behind it. And he took this further into very evocative images. This one, you'll see. I believe this one was at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, not in the Prado or the Picasso Museum. So if you want to see some of these, they'll be there. But you know, you couldn't. Yeah, if you see a woman just crying in a photograph, it's impactful. But when you see a woman shattered and placed back together, it appeals even more. Thought I'd just throw this one in there. This one is at the Picasso Museum, and it just shows how much he emulated this Velázquez's role in breaking down those boundaries of illusion and promoting the artist and things like that. And so there's a cool overlay of this Picasso's version of Las Meninas with the original version in the Picasso Museum.
Is that Picasso up there?
Yeah, it kind of. He almost paints just Velázquez. I mean, he painted Velázquez's mustache, really. So he's not really painting him as himself there. So.
The the dog.
Yeah.
Dog is fun.
Then finishing up with Picasso, getting into his probably most famous painting, which is Guernica. It's entitled Guernica. It's a little of the background on that before we look at it, is that this was based on, Picasso lived most of his life in Paris, actually. He came back and forth to Barcelona, Madrid, at various points during his life, but he spent most of his time in Paris. So when Francisco Franco, the phalangist, which is kind of a version of Spanish fascism, dictator, started making noises and fighting against with his nationalist group, fighting against the Republicans who were pro-monarchy, more of a leftist version of a movement. And then Franco's forces were a fascist rightist version, and they were clashing, and this clashed into the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 1939, which really, that is still a scar in Spain even today, its psyche. And so Franco's government actually naively commissioned Picasso to do a painting for the Spanish pavilion at the World's Fair in 1937. And they were not happy with what they got, because Picasso, instead of doing a rah-rah Spain kind of thing, he did a version of his Cubist impression of the bombing of a small town, Guernica, in the País Vasco. That was that Franco saw as a hotbed of rebels that would threaten his reign. And so he basically made a deal with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He made a deal with Hitler that said, basically, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So I'll get behind you, and what you're going to do in a few years here, right? If you send your Air Force to bomb this town, okay? It was a fairly small town, but it just was devastated, and it just sent this message to the country that it was a really psychologically scary thing to see that people just bomb the crap out of you if you mess with it, kind of thing. And so this is Franco in the middle there. And this is Picasso's rendering of not the literal quality of that, but I mean, if you look at what the city looked like afterwards, the crumbling, the fracturing, the devastation, the pain in the faces, you see that kind of reflected in this image. And it is in black and white. This isn't just a black and white image of it. Probably intentionally. Again, that two sides, when we're at war, we think that one side, the white side, is fighting against the black side. And where's that gray area in there, the fracturing. It's got symbols of Spain in here, like the bull, which has been a long time symbol of fertility. I mean, it's mythological, the Minotaur, and Picasso was really, you'll see that as a motif in a lot of his work, but it's definitely also that image of Spain and its kind of lifeblood draining out of it kind of thing. This tortured, screaming horse, the Spanish horses is another, indicative aspect of that. The mother crying over her child, the electric light versus the old light, the old versus the new, the sword broken in his hand, and then just the fractured quality of it. It's supposed to be a very emotional piece, and it's very large, so you really feel it. So this is at the Reina Sofia. The Reina Sofia is Madrid's contemporary art museum, like modern art museum. And so this is its crown jewel, though, definitely. It's worth a look, but definitely to go see this, that's what you
I'll just say that if there's any, we have a very limited time in Madrid, but if it works out and we arrive when we're supposed to, that afternoon, you won't be able to get into the hotel right away anyway, so you'll have basically that whole first day to do what you want. And you have maps now of where your hotel is, and you can start looking up where those other museums are. So that might be a day to go to another museum, since we do Prado as a do the next morning before spending the afternoon at the hotel.
Just a couple other little weird things. If you ever find, I know you don't have time on this time, but if you ever find yourself back in Spain at some point, near Madrid, there's a really weird monument to Franco. It's his tomb, and a real monument to him called the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. And it's this really creepy, fascist architecture kind of thing. It's really super creepy. And then you go down into the little place. You go into the mountain here, and Franco's tomb is back there, and there's all these weird, like, massive, like, angels leaning over with torches. Awesome.
Oh my
Super free chance. But I'd throw this in here too, as we're talking about modern artists. You may get a chance when you're around Spain, see some, especially around Barcelona, you see some work of this artist as well. Anthony Tapier, he's still alive. He's probably the most famous contemporary artist, Spanish artist. Now, and he's an abstractionist. I mean, he's kind of, in a sense, he wouldn't be here without Picasso breaking open that door of what art had to be, right? And so he's kind of delves off the street art and some plays off the Spanish flag and things like that. But you might see his name mentioned around. So let's touch on Dali and Gaudi here before we go. And so Dali, his famous mustache, right? I mean, you can always recognize him. I'm going to tell you right now, Dali is not an easy dude to talk about in a lot of ways because he didn't make sense in any respect, whether he was talking, painting, whatever. And it's you kind of just got to go with a lot of uncertainty with Dali. It's not really obvious like, oh, this stands for this and this stands for this, and he wasn't really clear about that. He liked messing with people, very eccentric personality. So he was part of the surrealist movement, which got a lot of its ideas initially from Sigmund Freud, and especially the book The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899. And this version is the English version, it was published in 1913. But Freud, of course, talking about this idea that our dreams have symbolism in them, and that we have a lot of unconscious fears and desires that are expressed in our, held in our subconscious, but then they come out in our dreams or in our actions sometimes without us intending it, and things like that. Dali himself was kind of a Freudian dream, if you will, in a way too, because his family had another brother that was born before him, 9 months before him, and died of gastroenteritis. But when he was 5, Dali claimed that his parents took him to his the dead brother's grave, who he was named after.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and told him that he was a reincarnation of his dead brother. And he said, in fact, that he took this kind of to heart, and he said of his brother that we resembled each other like 2 drops of water, but we had different reflections, and that he, the brother, was probably a first version of myself, but conceived too much in the absolute. So he felt himself like the other side of this mirror almost. His father also married. Dali's mother died when he was 16 of breast cancer, and it was really devastating because his mother was a lot more permissive towards his eccentricities and his volatile attitudes, which he had from the time of when he was little, and his burgeoning artistic technique interest. And his father was very autocratic and suppressive of that kind of stuff. And so and then his father, when his mother died, his father married his mother's younger sister. So his family had a little trouble with boundaries, right? and which caused Dali a lot of problems. But Dali fell in with this group of surrealists that were started by a guy named André Breton. That he was kind of an artist, but he was more of a theoretical artist. And when he wrote the Surrealist Manifesto about this idea of paradoxes and questioning reality and things like that, is reality really what we think it is? Kind of brought up around the times of these world wars, where millions of people are dying, and like, is this rationality? Is this reality? Is this what sort of those questions are being asked? One of his most famous paintings, of course, is the persistence of memory, the fluidity of time. Probably is at the root of this. One of his other famous works fairly early on, was a piece called a film called Un Chien Andalou, which doesn't have, it says, that translates to the title does to an Andalusian dog. There is not a dog anywhere in this film, but it's this very surrealist film that he did with a guy named Luis Buñuel. But the famous scene in this that is replicated, in lots of different popular culture stuff that you'll see even today, is this scene that, and this is done in 1929, so this was fairly rudimentary visual effects, but even today I show this to my class sometimes, and even they jerk and are like, what just happened there? Because in this film still, they show somebody's eye, they're pulling this gal's eye open, and slashing it with a razor, and there's gelatinous stuff coming out. And the surrealists were very interested in the idea of sight, and the idea that we understand the world through our eyes, and we seeing is believing, and reality and truth, and saying things like that. So there's probably some symbolism in that. It was really a goat eye that they went to the market, bought a goat
No
head.
women were sacrificed in the
Yeah,
name of this film.
but you know, the symbolism of it carried through to Alfred Hitchcock, you know, modern horror films, and all sorts of psychologically disturbing stuff. Yeah, so, and when you go to Figueres, which is just, you know, outside of Barcelona, that's where Dalí was born and died, and that's where his museum is at, in a old theater that was the site of where he had his first art show when he was 14, after he got expelled from art school because he said, none of the teachers are competent enough to judge me. Anyway, and so, but, and across the street from it, he had there's a church where he had his first communion, and his house where he was born is not far away, and so it's a very significant place for him. But and at this museum that he built, and it's a really bizarre place. I'll show you a couple pictures of it if you haven't seen it yet. But you'll see some portraits of him that are famous, like these soft self-portraits, kind of harken back to something like Michelangelo did on the Sistine Chapel, showing himself, painted his self-portrait of the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew and things like that. And he was kind of, you know, artists are always referencing something else. It's almost never a vacuum, right? And so he was saying that this is his self-portrait. And he painted a series of these, but this one's at the Dalí Museum, and it's kind of famous because it's got this little piece of bacon down here too. And so he said about this, that this is a self-portrait that's kind of an anti-self-portrait. Yeah, it's there, so you know who he is, right? But instead of painting the soul of the inside, he wanted to paint solely the outside, the envelope, the glove of myself. This is how he talked all the time. This glove of myself is edible and even a little gamey. This is why ants are shown, together with a strip of bacon. I am the most generous of painters, and since I am constantly offering myself to be eaten, and thus I succulently nourish our time. What does that mean? I know, but that's what I know. You know, that's just, he talked like that a lot. He felt he was offering his body up to be eaten. So, probably, when you go to the Dalí Museum, though, one of the most important things to understand is Dalí's obsession with his wife, Gala. And it threads through almost everything he did. And this image here, I think, is really cool because it shows his technical prowess. I mean, he really was a good painter. I mean, really, really good. And surrealists tend to paint things of that movement, tend to paint things like they're realistic, but then place things in paradoxical fashion, like things that don't go together. This was a pretty straightforward portrait, but he does portray his wife here as both kind of a mother symbol and a sexual symbol at the same time. And that was kind of something that she definitely, a definite role that she played in his life, of his caretaker, and his really rock, and he was obsessed with her. He was obsessed with her. And so a lot of the work that you'll see there has to do with it. This is one of her dreams, his illustration of one of her dreams. A dream inspired by the flight of a bee around a pomegranate a second before awakening. You know, and you know, a lot of his work has fairly obvious sexual violence, you know, kind of themes about those things that we don't like to talk about amongst each other a lot, you know, but that when you talk about that we might see in our dreams, and that's kind of what these look like, almost like you're painting a dream. And this one I was going to show you. This elephant shows up in a lot of his work. It was an elephant that was originally come from the Baroque sculptor Bernini, and he was an Italian sculptor, and he was tasked by the Pope at the time Bernini was, to make a sculpture for this obelisk, this Egyptian obelisk that was found in the garden of a church in Italy, in Rome. And so Bernini sculpted this elephant as a base for it that was intended to be, you know, the elephant to him symbolized stability and sturdiness and things like that. And there was, you know, it was also dedicated to Minerva, the goddess of knowledge, and there was a weird connection between Christianity and Greco-Roman mythology that was really prevalent during that time. And anyway, what Dalí does with it is he takes away the stability of it, and he puts it on these spindly little things, so he questions our institutions, the church. He questions our reality. Do we really know what we know? Do we really have this basis that we think we have? Do we, I don't know, do understand what is real, you know, and do we really understand what to trust? So here's some other ones that you'll see in the Museum of Gala. Some more traditionally painted, some more surrealistically painted. These are not in the museum, but I thought they were interesting because they basically paint her as a Madonna figure, right? But he was also interested in metaphysics as well. So these are similar to some of the work that you'll see in the Dali Museum, in that they have this kind of geometric patterning, voids and patterns of nature and things like that that he was kind of alluding to connections to. This one is in the Dali Museum as well, as Tristan, and his version of Tristan and Isolde that he was painting for a ballet set, actually. So this is large. And he, of course, viewed Isolde as a praying mantis kind of form, that she was going to consume her mate. She was so, you know, consumed with love for him. He was kind of a back and forth dude on what he believed in. War-wise, he was actually kicked out of the surrealist group for believing he had sympathies with Hitler. Whether he did or not, though, we're not really sure. But he made some pretty evocative images about war and death. You know, down at the bottom is a portrait of him with somebody else's work, Philippe Halsman's photograph of an image that evokes his drawing of a body made out of skulls. I mean, so mirror and a mirror and a mirror kind of thing. And so, and you know, and some of his more symbolic reincorporated nature back into design.
And that's pronounced well.
This is a really cool park above Barcelona that you can go to. It's just colorful and whimsical and just crazy. It's really cool. So that's all I got, and I know that's plenty, but
Thank you. How lucky, right?
But hopefully, just when you go see these things, you'll have a little context where you at least say, hey, I recognize that. I might not remember what you said about it, but you know, you'll pay a little more attention to it because you saw it.
Fly you over.